When fear grips a community, when uncertainty clouds every conversation, and when hope seems like a distant memory, sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected source. In a small town where whispers of worry had replaced laughter in coffee shops, where neighbors avoided eye contact on once friendly streets, and where children sensed the heavy silence of adults who had run out of answers, one woman's courage would remind an entire community what it meant to stand together. Catherine Martinez had never considered herself a leader. She was simply a mother, a neighbor, a woman who watered her garden every morning and waved to strangers. But sometimes, ordinary people are called to do extraordinary things. And sometimes, the most powerful messages come not from podiums or stages, but from the heart of someone who refuses to let fear win. This is the story of how one woman's words became a beacon of hope when her community needed it most, and how residents who had forgotten how to believe learned to applaud not just her message, but the strength they discovered within themselves. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street, but Catherine Martinez barely noticed as she stepped onto her front porch with a steaming cup of coffee. The familiar ritual that once brought her peace now felt different somehow. The neighborhood that had always buzzed with activities seemed unusually quiet, as if the very air held its breath. Catherine had lived in Willowbrook for 15 years, watching children grow up, families move in and out, and seasons change with predictable comfort. She knew Mrs. Henderson would be tending to her roses by 7:30, that Tom Phillips would jog past her house at exactly 8:15, and that the Johnson kids would race their bikes down the sidewalk before school. But lately, these small certainties had begun to shift. It started 3 months ago with whispers in the grocery store checkout line. Sarah Chen, who worked at the town's largest employer, mentioned rumors of layoffs. Nothing confirmed, just whispers. But whispers have a way of growing in small towns, spreading like ripples in a pond until they become waves of uncertainty. Catherine watched as Mrs. Henderson emerged from her house, but instead of heading to her beloved rose garden, the elderly woman hurried to her mailbox with quick, nervous steps. She grabbed the mail and retreated inside without her usual cheerful wave. The sight tugged at Catherine's heart. She had known Eleanor Henderson since moving to the neighborhood, had shared countless conversations over the fence that separated their yards, had brought soup when Eleanor was recovering from surgery last winter. The changes weren't just in Mrs. Henderson. Tom Phillips still jogged past her house, but his usual energetic stride had become mechanical, distracted. When Catherine waved, he offered a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes before quickly looking away. The Johnson children still rode their bikes, but their laughter seemed forced. And Catherine noticed how quickly they disappeared inside when their parents called. At 38, Catherine had seen difficult times before. She remembered the economic struggles of her childhood, when her parents worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. She understood worry had felt its weight in her chest during her divorce 5 years ago, when she wondered how she would manage as a single mother to 10-year-old Sophia. But this felt different. This wasn't personal worry confined to individual households. This was collective anxiety spreading through their community like fog, obscuring the connections that had once made Willowbrook feel like home. The first town meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in late September. Catherine almost didn't go. She told herself she was too busy with work, that Sophia needed help with homework, that these meetings never accomplished anything anyway. But something inside her, a restless energy she couldn't name, pulled her toward the community center that evening. The usually spacious room felt cramped with nearly 200 residents packed into folding chairs and standing along the walls. Catherine found a seat near the back, nodding to familiar faces while noting the tension that seemed to radiate from every corner of the room. Mayor Davidson stood at the front, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something that looked suspiciously like uncertainty. "Thank you all for coming," Mayor Davidson began, his voice carrying less authority than usual. "I know there have been concerns about recent developments in our community, and I want to address them as directly as possible." Catherine watched as neighbors leaned forward in their seats. These were people she had known for years, had chatted with at school events and neighborhood barbecues, had borrowed sugar from and loaned books to. But tonight, they looked like strangers to her, their faces marked by worry and suspicion. "As many of you know," the mayor continued, "Consolidated Manufacturing has announced they will be restructuring their operations. While they haven't confirmed specific numbers, we are expecting significant job losses in our community." A murmur rippled through the crowd, though the news wasn't entirely surprising. Consolidated Manufacturing employed nearly 40% of Willowbrook's workforce, either directly or through support services. The company had been the backbone of the community's economy for 3 decades, supporting local businesses, funding school programs, and providing the stability that allowed families to build lives here. "What does that mean for property values?" called out Janet Morrison from the third row. Catherine recognized her as the mother of Sophia's classmate, a woman who had always been friendly but never seemed particularly worried about anything.
"Are they closing completely?" asked another voice from the crowd.
What about the school district? How will this affect our children? The questions came faster than Mayor Davidson could answer them, each one adding another layer of uncertainty to an already anxious room. Catherine found herself studying the faces around her, seeing fear where she had once seen confidence, suspicion where she had once seen trust. "We don't have all the answers yet," Mayor Davidson finally said, raising his hands for quiet. "But I want to assure everyone that the town council is working closely with state representatives and economic development agencies to explore all options." "That's what you said last year when Riverside Retail closed," someone shouted from the back of the room. Now Main Street looks like a ghost town. Catherine turned to see who had spoken and recognized Bill Torres, who owned the hardware store that had been in his family for 2 generations. His face was flushed with frustration, and she could see the worry lines that seemed to have deepened since she had last seen him. The meeting continued for another hour, but little concrete information emerged. Plans were vague, timelines uncertain, and solutions seemed as elusive as morning mist. As residents filed out of the community center, Catherine overheard fragments of conversation that would stay with her for days. "Maybe it's time to start looking elsewhere," whispered one young mother to her husband as they walked past Catherine. "I heard Peterson's already put their house on the market," said an older man to his companion. "This town is finished," declared someone behind her with bitter certainty. Catherine drove home in silence, her mind churning with everything she had heard and seen. The faces of her neighbors haunted her, particularly Mrs. Henderson, who had sat alone near the front of the room, her shoulders curved inward, as if she were trying to disappear entirely. She thought about Sophia, asleep at home with the babysitter, blissfully unaware of the uncertainty that seemed to be consuming the adults in her world. Over the following weeks, the changes in Willowbrook became more pronounced. The morning joggers still ran, but they wore earbuds now, avoiding the casual conversations that had once been part of the neighborhood rhythm. Children's voices seemed quieter in the playground behind Catherine's house. The weekly farmers' market that had been a community gathering point for years saw smaller crowds, and several vendors stopped coming altogether. Catherine began to notice other signs of her community's growing isolation. Halloween decorations appeared later and seemed half-hearted. The annual fall festival, that typically filled the town square with laughter and music, was postponed indefinitely. Even the coffee shop where she had spent countless Saturday mornings reading while Sophia played with friends felt different. Conversations conducted in hushed tones, smiles that didn't quite reach anyone's eyes. But it was Sophia who finally put into words what Catherine had been feeling. One evening in early October, as they sat at the kitchen table working on homework, her daughter looked up from her math problems with troubled eyes. "Mum, why is everyone so sad lately?" Sophia asked, her pencil poised over a worksheet about fractions that suddenly seemed absurdly insignificant. Catherine paused, unsure how to explain something she barely understood herself. How could she tell her 10-year-old daughter that their community was losing hope? How could she describe the way fear was slowly erasing the connections that had made their neighborhood feel like home? "People are worried about changes that might happen," Catherine said finally, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes when we don't know what's going to happen next, we feel scared." Sophia nodded solemnly, her young face serious in a way that made Catherine's heart ache. "Are you scared too, Mum?" The question caught Catherine off guard, forcing her to confront feelings she had been trying to push aside. Was she scared? Yes, she realized she was scared of losing the community that had embraced her as a young divorcee trying to rebuild her life. She was scared of watching her neighbors retreat into isolation. She was scared of the possibility that Sophia would grow up in a place where people had forgotten how to trust each other. But she was also something else, something that took her a moment to recognize. She was angry. Not at her neighbors, not even at the circumstances that had brought uncertainty to their community. She was angry at fear itself, at the way it was stealing the warmth and connection that had made Willowbrook special. "Sometimes I feel scared," Catherine told her daughter honestly. "But you know what I feel even more? I feel like we can't let being scared stop us from taking care of each other." Sophia smiled at this, the first genuine smile Catherine had seen from her in weeks. "Like how you always take soup to Mrs. Henderson when she's sick." "Exactly like that," Catherine said, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. That night, after Sophia had gone to bed, Catherine sat on her porch in the cool October air and thought about her conversation with her daughter. Around her, the neighborhood was quiet in a way that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Porch lights were on, but no one sat outside to enjoy the mild evening. Curtains were drawn, creating barriers between families who had once known each other's daily rhythms. She thought about Mrs. Dobling Henderson, alone in her house with no one to share her worries with. She thought about Bill Torres, watching his family business struggle as foot traffic on Main Street dwindled. She thought about all the neighbors she had seen at the town meeting, their faces marked by fear and uncertainty. And she thought about Sophia's question, why is everyone so sad lately? Maybe, Catherine thought as she watched a leaf drift down from the old oak tree in her front yard, the better question was, what could they do to help each other feel less sad? What would it take to remind her community that they were stronger together than they were alone? She didn't have answers yet, but for the first time in months she felt something that fear hadn't quite managed to extinguish. She felt determination. She felt the stirring of an idea that was still too fragile to name but too strong to ignore. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees that lined Maple Street, and Catherine pulled her sweater closer around her shoulders. Tomorrow, she decided, she would start with something small. She would take soup to Mrs. Bessie Henderson, just as Sophia had suggested. And maybe, just maybe, that small act of connection would be the beginning of something larger. Catherine didn't know it yet, but sitting on her porch in the gathering darkness, she was about to become exactly what her community needed most. Someone willing to speak up when everyone else had forgotten how to find their voice. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that usually filled Catherine with energy. But as she prepared Sophia's breakfast and packed her daughter's lunch, she felt an unusual nervousness fluttering in her stomach. The determination she had felt the night before remained, but in the bright light of day her plan seemed both more urgent and more daunting. After dropping Sophia at school, Catherine drove to the grocery store with a mental list that had nothing to do with her usual weekly shopping. Ingredients for soup, she told herself, but she knew she was really shopping for courage. As she moved through the familiar aisles, she noticed other shoppers moving with the same distracted efficiency she had observed everywhere lately. Quick purchases, minimal eye contact, conversations reduced to polite nods. At the checkout counter, she found herself behind Maria Santos, whose husband worked at Consolidated Manufacturing. Maria had always been one of the more social residents of Willowbrook, organizing book clubs and volunteering at school events. But today her usual bright demeanor was replaced by something Catherine recognized as barely contained anxiety. "How are you doing, Maria?" Catherine asked as they waited in line, genuinely wanting to know the answer. Maria turned, and for a moment Catherine saw relief flash across her face, as if she had been waiting for someone to ask that question with real interest. "Honestly," Maria said, lowering her voice, "I'm trying not to panic. Roberto still has his job, but every day we wait for the other shoe to drop. We've started looking at apartments in the next county, just in case." She paused, then added with forced lightness, "How are you holding up?" Catherine felt a familiar tug of recognition. Here was someone else who was trying to balance hope with practical fear. Someone else who was wondering if they should start making escape plans from a place they had thought of as home. "I'm scared too," Catherine admitted, and something in her honesty seemed to unlock something in Maria. "I keep thinking about the kids," Maria continued, her voice growing stronger. "Emma has finally settled in here, made good friends, loves her teacher. The idea of uprooting her again." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. They talked for another few minutes while the line moved slowly forward, and by the time Catherine reached her car, she realized something important had happened. She felt less alone with her worries, and she could see that Maria felt the same way. The simple act of honest conversation had reminded them both that they weren't facing uncertainty and isolation. Back home, Catherine threw herself into making soup with an intensity that had little to do with cooking. She chopped vegetables with precision, seasoned the broth with care, and let the familiar rhythm of preparation calm her racing thoughts. This wasn't just soup, she realized. This was her first small act of rebellion against the fear that was isolating her community. When the soup was ready, she ladled it into a large container and walked across the yard to Mrs. Henderson's back door. She could see Eleanor through the kitchen window, sitting at her small table with a cup of tea, staring out at her neglected garden. Catherine knocked gently, and when Mrs. Ben said, "Henderson," opened the door, the older woman's face lit up with genuine surprise and pleasure. "Catherine, dear." What a lovely surprise. Eleanor's voice carried its usual warmth, but Catherine could see the strain around her eyes, the way her shoulders seemed to carry invisible weight. "I made too much soup again," Catherine said with a smile that felt more natural than any expression she had worn in weeks. "I thought you might help me with the overflow problem." Eleanor accepted the container with hands that trembled slightly. And Catherine noticed how thin her neighbor had become, how the worry of the past months had carved new lines in her face. "Would you like to come in for tea?" Eleanor asked, and Catherine heard something in her voice that sounded like hope. They sat in Eleanor's sunny kitchen, surrounded by the photographs and small treasures that told the story of a life well lived. Eleanor had been a teacher for 35 years, had raised 3 children in Willowbrook, had been widowed for a decade but had never seemed lonely until recently. "I've been thinking about moving," Eleanor said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if she had been holding them in for too long. "My daughter in Phoenix keeps calling, saying I should come live near her. She thinks this place is dying." Catherine felt her heart sink. Mrs. Henderson had been one of the constants in the neighborhood, a source of wisdom and kindness, who had helped Catherine navigate everything from gardening disasters to parenting challenges. "What do you think?" Catherine asked carefully. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, stirring her tea with unnecessary attention. "I think I'm scared," she said finally. "Scared of staying, scared of leaving. Scared of being alone with all this uncertainty." The honesty in Eleanor's voice moved Catherine deeply. Here was this woman who had taught generations of children, who had weathered every kind of storm life could offer, admitting to the same fears that kept Catherine awake at night. "You're not alone," Catherine said. And as the words left her mouth, she realized she meant them in a way that surprised her. "I know it feels like it sometimes, but you're not alone." They talked for over an hour, sharing worries and memories, fears and hopes. When Catherine finally left, she carried with her not just Eleanor's gratitude, but a growing conviction that these conversations were exactly what their community needed most. Over the following days, Catherine found herself having similar encounters throughout Willowbrook. She stopped to chat with Bill Torres when she saw him sweeping the sidewalk in front of his hardware store, and learned that he was considering selling not because he wanted to, but because he felt like he had no choice. She spent 15 minutes talking with the young mother she had overheard at the town meeting, discovering that her name was Jessica and that she was torn between her love for Willowbrook and her fear that staying would limit her children's opportunities. Each conversation reinforced Catherine's growing understanding that their community's problem wasn't really economic uncertainty, though that was certainly real and challenging. The deeper problem was isolation, the way fear was causing people to retreat from each other at exactly the moment when connection was most necessary. The idea came to her on a Wednesday evening in late October as she helped Sophia with a school project about community helpers. Sophia was drawing pictures of firefighters and teachers and doctors, people whose job it was to take care of others. As Catherine watched her daughter's careful work, she found herself wondering who was taking care of their community's emotional needs during this difficult time. "Mum," Sophia said, looking up from her drawing.
"Remember when we had that block party last summer?"
Everyone was so happy that day. Catherine did remember. The annual Maple Street Block Party had been Eleanor's idea originally, a way to bring neighbours together for an afternoon of food and conversation. Last summer's gathering had been particularly successful, with families spilling out of yards and into the street, children running between houses like they owned the whole neighbourhood, adults lingering long after sunset to continue conversations that had started over shared plates of food.
"What made everyone so happy that day?"
Catherine asked, genuinely curious about her daughter's perspective. Sophia considered this seriously. "I think it was because everyone was talking to everyone else," she said finally. "Like really talking, not just saying hello, but telling stories and laughing about stuff." Catherine felt something click into place in her mind. Sophia had identified exactly what had been missing from their community lately: real conversation, genuine connection, the kind of sharing that reminded people they belonged to something larger than their individual worries. That night, after Sophia was asleep, Catherine sat at her kitchen table with a notebook and began to write. Not a formal plan, not a structured proposal, just thoughts and ideas about what their community needed and how she might help provide it. She wrote about the conversations she had been having with neighbours, about the relief and connection she had seen in their faces when someone took the time to really listen to their concerns. She wrote about the way fear was isolating people who had once been sources of support for each other. She wrote about Sophia's observation that happiness seemed to come from genuine conversation, from people taking the time to share their stories with each other. By the time she finally went to bed, Catherine had filled several pages with what felt less like notes and more like the beginning of a mission statement. She wasn't sure yet what form her ideas would take, but she knew with increasing certainty that she needed to do something more than just make soup for individual neighbours. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. 3 days later, she received a phone call from Mayor Davidson's office, asking if she would be willing to serve on a newly formed Citizens Advisory Committee. The committee's purpose, the mayor's assistant explained, was to provide input on how the town should respond to the economic challenges they were facing. Catherine's first instinct was to decline. She had never been involved in local politics, had never seen herself as someone who belonged in meetings with city officials and business leaders. But as she considered the invitation, she thought about all the conversations she had been having with neighbours, about all the fears and hopes she had been hearing. Maybe, she thought, this was exactly where she needed to be. "I'd be honoured to serve," she told the mayor's assistant, and as she hung up the phone, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine excitement about the future. The first committee meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, and Catherine spent the days leading up to it continuing to have conversations with neighbours, but now with a specific purpose. She wasn't just offering comfort and connection anymore. She was gathering stories, collecting insights, building an understanding of what her community truly needed. She learnt that Bill Torres had ideas about how Main Street could be revitalized with local businesses, but it never felt like anyone in city government would listen to his suggestions. She discovered that Maria Santos had experience in non-profit management and had been thinking about ways to organize community support networks, but hadn't known how to get started. She found that Jessica, the young mother she had met at the town meeting, was actually a marketing professional who had moved to Willowbrook specifically because she believed in the power of small communities. By Thursday evening, Catherine arrived at the committee meeting with more than just her own perspective. She carried with her the voices of dozens of neighbours, the hopes and ideas of people who had been feeling unheard and disconnected. The meeting was held in the town hall conference room around a long table that made the 12 committee members feel both important and intimidated. Catherine recognized most of the other members: business owners, long-time residents, community leaders who had been involved in local affairs for years. Mayor Davidson opened the meeting by outlining the challenges they faced and the need for creative solutions. Other committee members spoke about economic development strategies, tax incentives for new businesses, and marketing campaigns to attract outside investment. All worthy ideas, Catherine thought as she listened, but somehow missing the point. When her turn came to speak, Catherine felt her heart racing. She looked around the table at faces that were familiar but formal in this setting, and realized that she was about to say something that might change everything, or might fall completely flat. "I've been talking to a lot of our neighbours over the past few weeks," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "And I think our biggest challenge isn't economic, at least not entirely. I think our biggest challenge is that people are losing faith in each other and in our community." She paused, noting the attention she had captured around the table. "We have incredible resources right here," Catherine continued, gaining confidence as she spoke. "People with skills and ideas and energy who are ready to work together, but they feel isolated and unheard. Before we try to attract new businesses or new residents, maybe we need to help the people who are already here remember why they chose Willowbrook in the first place." The room was quiet for a moment after she finished speaking. Then committee member after committee member began to nod, to build on her ideas, to share their own observations about the community's need for connection and renewed purpose. By the end of the evening, they had outlined a plan that was unlike anything Catherine had expected when she walked into the meeting. Instead of focusing solely on economic development, they would launch a series of community engagement initiatives designed to rebuild the social connections that were the foundation of any thriving town. As Catherine drove home that night, she realized that something fundamental had shifted. She had found her voice as a community advocate. But more than that, she had helped other people find their voices too. The isolation and fear that had been growing for months hadn't disappeared, but they had been challenged by something stronger: the recognition that they were all in this together, and that together they had the power to write their own story. The real work was just beginning. But for the first time since the trouble started, Catherine felt genuinely hopeful about what that work might accomplish. The November evening was crisp with the promise of winter, but the Willowbrook Community Centre had never felt warmer. Catherine stood at the side of the stage, watching as residents filed into chairs that had been arranged in a large circle rather than the traditional rows that had defined previous town meetings. The change in seating arrangement had been her suggestion, part of a broader vision to transform how their community talked to each other about their shared challenges and hopes. 3 weeks had passed since the Citizens Advisory Committee had approved Catherine's proposal for what she had tentatively called community conversation circles, and the response had exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. Instead of the typical town hall format where officials spoke to residents, these gatherings were designed to help neighbours speak to each other. to share stories and ideas in an atmosphere of mutual support and creative problem-solving. Tonight's meeting was the culmination of those smaller conversation circles, a chance for the entire community to hear what had emerged from weeks of honest dialogue about their collective future. Catherine felt the familiar flutter of nervousness in her stomach, but it was tempered by something stronger, a deep sense of purpose and a growing confidence in her community's resilience. Sophia sat in the front row with other children whose parents had chosen to make this a family event rather than leaving the kids at home with babysitters. Catherine caught her daughter's eye and received an encouraging smile that reminded her why she had started down this path in the first place, to help create a community where children could grow up feeling connected to something larger than themselves. Mayor Davidson opened the evening with brief remarks, but his role tonight was different from previous meetings. Instead of presenting solutions from the podium, he was here to facilitate a conversation that would be shaped by community members themselves. 3 months ago, the mayor began, "We gathered in this room to talk about challenges facing our community. Tonight, we're here to talk about solutions. Ideas that have emerged from your conversations with each other, your creativity, and your commitment to making Willowbrook not just survive these difficult times, but thrive in ways we haven't imagined before." Catherine watched the faces in the audience, seeing many of the same people who had attended that first worried meeting in September. But something fundamental had changed in those faces. The fear and suspicion were still there. She wasn't naive enough to think that 3 weeks of conversation had eliminated months of accumulated anxiety, but they were now mixed with something else: curiosity, engagement, and what she could only describe as cautious hope. Mrs. Henderson sat with Maria Santos and Jessica Chen, 3 women who had connected during one of the smaller conversation circles and had discovered they shared both concerns and complementary skills. Bill Torres was there with his wife Rosa, both of them looking more relaxed than Catherine had seen them in months. Throughout the room, she could see similar clusters of neighbors who had found new connections through the process, people who had moved beyond polite acquaintanceship to genuine friendship and collaboration. Mayor Davidson called Catherine to the front of the room, and as she walked toward the microphone, she felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The conversations with worried neighbors, the soup delivered to Mrs. Henderson, the realization that her community's greatest resource was the people who already lived here, the gradual recognition that she had something valuable to contribute to their collective future. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Catherine began, her voice carrying more easily than she had expected. "When I first started talking to neighbors about what's been happening in our community, I thought I was just trying to understand why everyone seems so worried and isolated. I didn't expect those conversations to change how I see our problems, or how I see our possibilities." She paused, looking out at faces that were attentive in a way that felt different from the anxious attention of previous meetings. People were leaning forward, not because they were afraid of what they might hear, but because they were genuinely interested in what would be said. Over the past few weeks, we've discovered that while we can't control everything that happens to us as a community, we can control how we respond to challenges. We can choose isolation and fear, or we can choose connection and creativity. Tonight, I want to share what we've learned when we choose connection. Catherine had spent days preparing for this moment, but as she began to speak, she found herself departing from her careful notes and speaking instead from the heart about the transformation she had witnessed in her community. She talked about Mrs. Henderson, who had been considering leaving Willowbrook, but had instead become the coordinator of a new neighborhood support network that paired longtime residents with newcomers to the area. Eleanor had discovered that her decades of teaching experience had given her invaluable skills for helping people navigate change, and her house had become an informal community center where neighbors gathered for everything from job search support to gardening advice. She shared the story of Bill Torres, who had initially been planning to sell his hardware store, but had instead partnered with several younger residents to expand into online sales and specialized services for the growing number of people who are choosing to work from home. His business was not just surviving, but thriving, and he had become a mentor for other local business owners who were learning to adapt to changing economic conditions. Catherine described the community garden that had emerged from one of the conversation circles, a project that had started with Jessica Chen's simple observation that many families were worried about food security. What had begun as a practical response to economic uncertainty had become something much more significant, a space where neighbors worked side by side, where children learned about growing things, where the rhythms of planting and harvesting created new traditions and connections. She talked about the skill-sharing network that had developed organically as people realized how many talents and resources existed within their community. Maria Santos had organized a system that connected residents who needed help with those who had skills to offer, creating an informal economy based on mutual aid rather than traditional employment. People were teaching each other everything from car repair to computer skills, from childcare to financial planning, rediscovering the truth that communities had always been strongest when neighbors took care of each other. But the most important thing we've learned, Catherine said, feeling her voice grow stronger as she approached the heart of her message, is that our future isn't something that happens to us. It's something we create together, one conversation at a time, one connection at a time, one act of mutual support at a time. She looked out at the audience and saw nodding heads, people who were recognizing their own experiences in the stories she was telling. These weren't abstract success stories about other communities. These were their stories, achievements they had accomplished together. 3 months ago, many of us were asking what would happen to Willowbrook if we lost the anchor employer that has supported our economy for so long. Tonight, I want to suggest that we've been asking the wrong question. Instead of asking what will happen to us, we should be asking what we want to create together. Catherine paused, feeling the attention in the room intensify. This was the moment she had been building toward, the message that had crystallized through weeks of listening to her neighbors' hopes and fears. We've learned that we don't need to wait for someone else to save our community. We don't need to depend entirely on large employers or government programs or outside investment, though all of those things can be helpful. What we need most is what we already have, each other and the willingness to work together toward a shared vision of what's possible. She gestured toward the people sitting in the circular arrangement of chairs, neighbors who had become collaborators and friends through the process of honest conversation about their community's future. Look around this room. These are the people who are going to determine what happens next in Willowbrook. Not officials or experts or outside developers, though they all have roles to play. The future of this community depends on us, on our willingness to talk to each other honestly, to support each other practically, and to work together creatively. The energy in the room was palpable now, a sense of collective recognition that Catherine could feel even from the front of the room. People were sitting straighter, looking at each other with new appreciation, beginning to see familiar faces in a new light. So here's my challenge to all of us, Catherine continued, feeling the power of her own conviction. Let's stop waiting for someone else to tell us what our community should become. Let's decide for ourselves. Let's build on the connections we've made over the past few weeks and keep creating the kind of place where we want our children to grow up, where we want to grow old, where we want to invite our friends and family to visit and maybe even stay. She took a breath, preparing to conclude with the words that had been forming in her heart throughout this entire journey. Change is happening whether we participate in shaping it or not. Economic forces, social pressures, demographic shifts, all of these things are going to continue affecting our community regardless of what we do. But we get to choose whether we face these changes as isolated individuals or as a connected community. We get to choose whether we respond with fear or with creativity. We get to choose whether we see challenges as reasons to give up or as opportunities to discover what we're capable of when we work together. Catherine looked out at faces that were now fully engaged, people who had moved from passive listening to active participation in imagining their collective future. She could see Mrs. Henderson wiping away tears, Bill Torres nodding with visible emotion, Maria Santos and Jessica Chen holding hands in a gesture of support and solidarity. The message I want to leave you with tonight is simple but powerful. We are not victims of circumstances beyond our control. We are neighbors and friends and family members who have the power to create the kind of community we want to live in. We have skills and resources and creativity and love for this place. Most importantly, we have each other. She paused one final time, feeling the weight of the moment and the responsibility of speaking for a community that had found its voice through the process of learning to listen to each other. The changes that worried us so much 3 months ago haven't disappeared. We still face economic uncertainty, and we still have work to do to build the kind of future we want. But we're not facing these challenges alone anymore. We're facing them together, and that makes all the difference. As Catherine stepped back from the microphone, the applause began slowly, hesitantly, and then built into something that filled the entire room. But it wasn't just applause for her words, it was recognition of their own transformation, celebration of their own capacity to create connection in the midst of uncertainty.
People rose from their chairs, not to leave, but to continue the conversations that had become the foundation of their community's renewal.
Catherine watched as neighbors embraced, as children ran between groups of adults who were making plans and sharing ideas, as the formal structure of the meeting dissolved into something much more valuable, the organic energy of a community that had remembered how to believe in itself. Mrs. Henderson approached Catherine first, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude rather than worry.
"Thank you, dear," Eleanor said, taking Catherine's hands in her own.
Thank you for helping us remember that we don't have to be afraid of the future when we're willing to create it together. Over the next hour, as the community centre gradually emptied, Catherine received similar thanks from dozens of neighbours. But she knew the gratitude was misplaced. She hadn't saved their community. They had saved it themselves by choosing connection over isolation, creativity over fear, collaboration over competition. As she walked home with Sophia skipping beside her, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with worry about her community's future and evolved into something much more powerful. A deep understanding of what makes communities resilient in the face of change. "Mum," Sophia said as they reached their front porch, "I think tonight was the best town meeting ever." Everyone looked so happy. Catherine smiled, remembering her daughter's earlier observation. That happiness seemed to come from genuine conversation, from people taking the time to share their stories with each other. Tonight had proven the wisdom of that 10-year-old insight. What made it different from the other meetings? Catherine asked, curious about Sophia's perspective on the evening.
Everyone was talking to everyone else again, Sophia said, echoing her words from weeks before.
Like at the block party, but even better. It felt like everyone remembered they were friends. As Catherine tucked Sophia into bed that night, she found herself thinking about the message that had emerged not just from her words, but from the entire process of community conversation and renewal they had experienced together. The most powerful message hadn't been spoken from a podium, it had been lived through. The daily choices of neighbours who had decided to choose connection over isolation. Outside her window, Willow Brook looked the same as it had 3 months ago. The same houses lined the same streets. The same trees cast the same shadows under the streetlights. But everything fundamental had changed. Her community had discovered that its greatest strength wasn't economic stability or geographic advantages or demographic trends. Its greatest strength was the willingness of ordinary people to take extraordinary care of each other. The challenges they faced hadn't disappeared. Economic uncertainty remained real, and the work of building a more resilient community would require ongoing effort and creativity. But Catherine went to sleep that night with a deep sense of peace, knowing that whatever the future brought, they would face it together. And in communities across the country, in towns and neighbourhoods where people were feeling disconnected and afraid, the story of what had happened in Willowbrook would begin to spread. Not because it was unique or extraordinary, but because it was replicable, because every community had Catherine Martinez's waiting to find their voices. Neighbours ready to choose connection over isolation. Residents who just needed someone to remind them that the power to create their future had been in their hands all along. The applause that had filled the community centre that evening would fade, but the message it celebrated would continue to resonate. When ordinary people choose to take care of each other, extraordinary transformation becomes not just possible, but inevitable.